The moment Augusta Rhodes saw the rider cresting the ridge above her property, her stomach dropped straight through the floorboards of the porch she was standing on. Because even at that distance, even with the afternoon sun blazing behind him like a hot iron brand against the August sky of 1882, she could read bad news in the set of a man's shoulders. She had been living on this land for 3 years, every single day of it fought for and earned with her own 2 hands, and the sweat of her brow, and the particular stubborn streak her mother had always called her greatest sin and her greatest gift. 3 years of drought seasons and dust storms, and a cattle market that swung like a barn door in a windstorm. 3 years since her husband Thomas Rhodes had gone out one October morning to check the southern fence line and never come back, his horse found wandering 2 miles west of the creek with no rider and no explanation that ever satisfied anyone, least of all Augusta herself. She was 28 years old, which was young enough that the widows in town still gave her the look, that particular combination of pity and calculation that meant they were sizing up her chances of remarrying before the land ate her alive. She was old enough to know better than to need anyone's opinion on the matter. She had 340 acres of Nebraska grassland, 12 head of cattle, a barn that needed a new roof on the eastern corner, and a land deal that had been in negotiation for 6 weeks with a railroad company that wanted to run a spur line across the northern edge of her property. That deal was supposed to save her. Not in the dramatic way of novels, not in the way of a white knight arriving on a pale horse, but in the practical way that mattered most in 1882 Nebraska. It was supposed to give her enough cash money to repair the barn, buy 20 more head of cattle, and put something in the bank that would carry her through a bad winter without having to sell the southern pasture, which she would sooner cut off her own arm than do, because the southern pasture was where Thomas had proposed to her under a cottonwood tree, and where she had buried him the following autumn, and some things were not for sale regardless of what the railroad thought. The rider came down off the ridge at a steady pace, not rushing, not the desperate gallop of a man bringing fire or flood news, but not the easy amble of a man bringing good news either. There was something deliberate about him, something that said he had rehearsed whatever he was coming to say and was not looking forward to saying it. Augusta set down the tin cup she was holding, the coffee long since gone cold, and walked to the edge of the porch steps. She shaded her eyes with her hand and watched him come. He was riding a good bay horse, well-kept and well-fed, which meant he was either a man of some means or a man who understood that in this country your horse was your life. He wore a plain dark coat over a clean shirt, and a hat that had seen weather but had been cared for, and there was something in the way he sat the horse that suggested he had grown up on horseback rather than learned it from necessity. He was not a railroad man in the city sense, but he was not quite a rancher either. He occupied some middle ground that she could not quite categorize, and Augusta had always been a woman who could categorize most things on sight. He reined in at the edge of her yard, the bay horse settling with a quiet blow of breath through its nose, and he took off his hat before he spoke, which immediately told her 2 things: that his mother had raised him right, and that he was definitely bringing bad news, because men only remembered their manners that quickly when they were bracing for impact. "Miss Rhodes," he said, and his voice was low and even, with a slight roughness to it that suggested the outdoors rather than any particular place, though she caught maybe a hint of something Missouri in the vowels. "Mrs. Rhodes," she said, not unkindly, just precisely. "What can I do for you?" He held his hat against his knee and looked at her directly, which she appreciated. Men who could not look you in the eye when they were delivering difficult information were men you could not trust with difficult information. "My name is Peter Calloway," he said. "I work with the Garfield Land and Survey Office in Hatchfield. I've been managing the documentation on the Northern Pacific Spur Line negotiations." He paused, just a fraction of a second, the way a person pauses when they are choosing between several versions of the same sentence. I've come to inform you that the land deal has fallen through, Mrs. Rhodes. The railroad company has changed their route. They'll be running the line 40 miles north of here. Your property is no longer under consideration. Augusta stood very still on the top step of her porch. The afternoon wind moved through the tall grass at the edge of her yard and made a sound like a long, slow exhale. A meadowlark called somewhere to the east. The world carried right on being itself while something that had been load-bearing inside her quietly gave way. She had known, from the moment she saw him on the ridge, that it was this. She had known in the way you know things before they are confirmed, in the place in your chest where the truth lives before the words arrive to give it a name. But knowing a thing and hearing it spoken aloud were two different experiences, and she stood for a moment inside the gap between them. "I see," she said. Her voice came out even, which surprised her. Peter Calloway was watching her with an expression that was careful and measured, but not without feeling. He was not relishing this. She could see that clearly enough. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know this news is not what you were hoping for. If it would be of any help, I can go over the full documentation with you, explain what changed and what your options might be going forward. I have copies of all the correspondence, the survey maps, everything. You have a right to all of it." Augusta looked at him for a long moment. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe 32, with dark hair worn a little long under the hat he was still holding against his knee, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in perhaps 2 or 3 days. There was a tiredness around his eyes that was not the tiredness of a poor night's sleep, but the tiredness of a man who spent a great deal of time carrying other people's difficult news across long distances. She did not know why she said what she said next. Perhaps it was the particular quality of his tiredness, or the way he had taken his hat off before speaking, or perhaps it was simply that she was a woman who had been alone for 3 years and the world was large and the afternoon was very long and she did not want to receive this particular blow entirely by herself. "Have you eaten?" she asked. He blinked. It was a small blink, a fractional recalibration of expectation. "Not since this morning, ma'am." "Then put your horse in the paddock by the barn," she said. "There's water and hay. Come inside. I'll put on fresh coffee and you can show me these documents." She did not wait to see his expression. She turned and went back through the door, because if she stood there looking at him any longer she was going to say something about the deal falling through that she would regret. And she had learned in 3 years of widowhood that it was better to move your body when your heart was about to make a scene. She had the coffee on, and the cup set out, and was slicing bread at the kitchen table when she heard his boots on the porch steps, that distinctive two-step rhythm of a tall man taking stairs without thinking about them. He knocked at the open door, which again told her things about his upbringing. "Come in, Mr. Calloway," she said without turning from the bread. He came in and stood just inside the doorway with a leather satchel under his arm and that hat still in his hand, turning the brim slowly with his fingers in the way that men did when they were not sure what to do with themselves. "Sit down," she said, and nodded toward the table. He sat. She brought the bread and a jar of preserves and set them between them and then brought the coffee, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything of substance. He ate with the serious attention of a man who had ridden a long way, and she watched him from the corner of her eye and thought about the southern pasture and the barn roof and the 20 head of cattle she was not going to buy. "How long have you been with the land office?" she asked, because silence in her kitchen felt like a thing she needed to manage. He looked up. 7 years, started as a surveyor's assistant, learned the documentation side of it. Mr. Garfield took me on full-time in '78. He paused. "I've done a lot of land negotiations with the railroad. I don't love this part of it. The part where you tell people their plans have collapsed." "That part," he agreed. Augusta wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Tell me what happened. The real version, not the polite one." He looked at her steadily, and she had the sense that he was deciding whether she could handle the real version, and she held his gaze long enough that he apparently concluded she could. "The Northern Pacific got a better offer on the northern route," he said. "Cheaper land, easier grade, and a couple of large cattle operations up there that agreed to exclusive shipping contracts. They were never as committed to the southern route as they presented themselves during negotiations. The timeline was aggressive. The terms they offered to landowners down here were lower than market, and when the northern route opened up, they took it without hesitation. He paused. Frankly, the deal they were offering you was not a good one to begin with. The per-acre compensation was below what comparable easement agreements have been running in other counties. Augusta was quiet for a moment. You're saying I should not be entirely devastated that it fell through. I'm saying there might be a silver lining to consider. There is no silver lining to a barn with a hole in its eastern corner and a cattle herd that is 12 head short of what I need it to be, she said, without heat, just flatly, because those were the facts. He absorbed that. No, he said. You're right. I apologize for suggesting otherwise. She looked at him with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. Men rarely apologized to her without prompting. Men who dealt in land and railroad contracts almost never apologized at all. "Show me the documents," she said. He opened the satchel and spread the papers on her kitchen table, and Augusta Rhodes, who had taught herself to read legal documents out of sheer necessity after Thomas died and the estate lawyers had tried to take advantage of what they assumed was her ignorance, bent over them with her glasses on her nose and read every word. It took an hour. Peter Calloway sat across from her and was patient in a way that she found remarkable. He did not fidget. He did not try to summarize for her or guide her eyes toward certain passages and away from others. He simply sat and drank his coffee, and when she had a question he answered it, and when she did not have a question he was quiet. Outside, the afternoon lengthened. The shadow of the big oak at the corner of the yard stretched itself across the yard in the particular way of late August in Nebraska, long and golden and slightly melancholy. "This clause here," Augusta said, tapping a paragraph near the middle of a densely printed page. "This says the railroad retains right of first refusal on the land for 5 years. Does that mean I can't sell to anyone else without offering it to them first?" Peter leaned forward to read where she was pointing. His shoulder was near hers across the narrow table, and she caught the smell of horses and sun-warmed cotton and something else, something that was simply the smell of another person, which she had not been conscious of missing until this moment. "That clause was in the original negotiating document," he said, "but because the deal didn't reach a signed agreement stage, that clause was never formally executed. You're not bound by it." He looked up and found her face very close to his. He did not pull back. Neither did she, though she straightened slightly. "You have no legal obligation to the Northern Pacific in any form." "Good," she said. She took off her glasses and set them on the table, because I was about to have a strong opinion about that. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "You have a strong opinion about most of what's in those pages, I imagine," he said. "I have a working knowledge of what I can and cannot afford to let people take from me," she said, "which is not the same thing as being difficult, though I've been called that." "By whom?" The question came out with a directness that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her, and for a moment they both registered that the conversation had moved somewhere slightly different than where it had started. "By the estate lawyers when Thomas died," she said. "By the 2 cattle buyers who tried to lowball me in the spring of '80. By my father-in-law who believed women should sign things without reading them." She paused. "By Thomas himself on occasion, though he meant it more affectionately than the others." Peter Calloway was quiet for a moment. "How long ago did you lose him?" 3 years last October." She gathered the documents into a neat pile and squared their edges with the precision of someone who needed their hands to be doing something organized. "He went out to check the southern fence line, and his horse came home without him. We found him 2 days later. Heart, the doctor said." "Quick, I'm sorry," Peter said, and this time it was not the perfunctory sorry of someone managing a difficult conversation. It was the smaller, quieter sorry of someone who had registered a specific pain in another person and wanted to acknowledge it. He was a good man, Augusta said. Not perfect, but good. He would have hated this business with the railroad. He had very strong feelings about people who made promises they had no intention of keeping. So do I, Peter said. Which is, partly, why this particular job has never suited me as well as it might. She looked at him. Then why do you do it? He considered the question with a seriousness that suggested he did not have a fully satisfying answer. Because I'm good at it, he said, and because someone has to be the person who reads the documents carefully and tells the truth about what they say. If I didn't do it, someone less careful would, and the people on the receiving end would be worse off. Augusta thought about this. She looked at the stack of documents on her table and then at the man who had brought them, and she found that she believed him, which was a more significant thing than it might appear, because Augusta Rhodes had become, over 3 years of necessity, a woman who was careful about what she believed and who she believed it from. There was a time, she said, not entirely sure why she was saying it, when this land was going to be something. Thomas and I had plans. We were going to build a proper house, not just this one, which was his parents' house and was built for a different sort of life. We were going to have children. She stopped. We never quite got to the children part before he died. The afternoon light had shifted fully into the golden register now, the hour before sundown when everything in Nebraska goes quiet and amber and impossibly beautiful in the particular way of places that have been difficult to live in all day, and are now briefly, generously, showing you why you stay. Peter did not offer a platitude. He sat with what she had said and let it take up its proper space in the room. "You're still here," he said after a while. "I'm still here," she agreed. "That's not a small thing." She looked at him again, this man at her kitchen table with his hat on the chair beside him and his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and she felt something shift in the air between them, something small and seismic at the same time, the way the ground in this country could feel still and then show you it was not. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "how far did you ride today?" "About 30 miles, he said. "I came from Hatchfield this morning. And you have to go back tonight." "I have a room at the boarding house in Birch Hollow, which is about 8 miles south of here." He looked out the window at the light. "I should probably start soon." "You probably should," she said, and neither of them moved. This was the moment, she would think about it later, when the evening stopped being about a land deal and became about something else entirely. This was the moment when they both understood, without saying it, that neither of them was particularly interested in ending the conversation. "Tell me about Hatchfield," she said. He looked at her as though making sure he had heard her correctly. Then he settled back slightly in his chair, a fractional unclenching of the posture of a man who has been on an errand all day, and is now, apparently, being allowed to simply be somewhere for a while. "It's a town that thinks more highly of itself than it has earned," he said. "There are 4 saloons and 2 churches and not enough of either. The land office is on Main Street across from the feed store, which is the most useful building in town, in my opinion." He paused. "It's loud on Saturday nights and too quiet on Monday mornings, and the food at the boarding house is tolerable if you avoid the soup." Augusta laughed, which surprised her. It was a short laugh, genuine and unguarded, and it seemed to surprise Peter Calloway as well in the most pleasant possible way. "What about before Hatchfield?" she asked. "Missouri," he said. "St. Joseph. My father had a small farm there. I was the second of 4 boys, which meant I was the one most likely to end up with the least land and the most ambition." He said it without bitterness, just as a fact. "I came west when I was 22. Worked a cattle drive for 1 season, which was enough to know that I preferred sleeping in a bed to sleeping on the ground, and then I fell into survey work almost by accident, and the rest of it followed." "You drove cattle?" "For about 4 months. I was terrible at it." "Well, I was adequate at the riding and the navigation, and completely hopeless at the part where you had to sleep with one ear open for wolves and rustlers. I'm a heavy sleeper." Augusta was watching him with an expression she was not entirely managing, something warm and undisguised that she was not accustomed to wearing on her face where another person could see it. She had been careful for 3 years about her expressions. She had been careful about what she let herself want. "What do you like about survey work?" she asked. "Besides the bed." He thought about this with the same seriousness he had brought to everything else. "You're the first person who's asked me that," he said. "That can't be right." "No, truly. Most people either want to talk about the railroad, or they want to talk about the land they're selling, or they want to argue about the valuations. Nobody asks what I like about it." He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. "I like the maps," he said. "I like the way a map can take something as large and complicated as 300 acres of varied land and turn it into something you can hold in your hands and understand. I like that it's honest. A map doesn't flatter the land or apologize for it. It just shows you what's there." Augusta was quiet for a moment. "That's a very precise sort of satisfaction," she said. "I'm a precise sort of person," he said. Most of the time he looked at her. "What do you like about ranching?" She did not hesitate. "The quiet," she said. "Not the silence, because this land is never truly silent. But the quality of the quiet out here, the way you can hear your own thinking. In the morning, especially before the work starts, when you're walking out to the barn and the light is just coming up and everything is still and possible. I like that." She paused. "I also like that it's mine. That everything that grows here or doesn't grow here, everything that lives here or doesn't live here, that's a consequence of my decisions. That's a weight, but it's also a freedom that I don't think I could give up." Peter Calloway looked at her across the table in the fading light, and there was something in his expression that she could not name precisely, but that felt like recognition, the particular look of a person seeing something in another person that they had not expected to find and that they find they cannot look away from. "You love this land," he said. "I do," she said. "I love it, and it is frequently trying to kill me, and we have reached an understanding." This time he laughed fully, a real laugh, not polished or restrained, and it changed his face entirely, and Augusta felt something in her chest that she recognized with a start as warmth, actual warmth, the kind she had been being very careful not to feel for 3 years. She stood up, not because she wanted to end the conversation, but because she needed to do something with herself for a moment. She went to the window and looked out at the yard. The last of the direct sunlight was gone, the sky in the west going deep orange and rose, the barn casting a long shadow across the paddock where his bay horse stood with its head over the fence, patient and still. "Your horse needs water," she said. "I watered him when I put him in the paddock," Peter said. He had turned in his chair to watch her at the window. "But he might appreciate a bit of hay." "I'll get it in a moment." She turned back from the window. The kitchen was warm with the residual heat of the stove she had been cooking on earlier, and in the soft orange light of the setting sun coming through the glass, it was a different kind of place than it was in the harsh clarity of midday. It was the kind of place where things could be said that might be harder to say in broad daylight. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "you should probably know that I am not in the habit of inviting strangers into my kitchen to eat my bread and drink my coffee. I have a reputation in this county for being self-sufficient to the point of rudeness." He was watching her with steady attention. "I know," he said. "Mrs. Haverson at the land office mentioned it when I was given this assignment. She said, and I believe I'm quoting accurately, that Augusta Rhodes would sooner bite your hand off than let you help her." Augusta stared at him. Then she sat back down. "She said that. She was trying to prepare me for a difficult conversation," he said. "She's not wrong about you, I don't think, but she's not entirely right either." "What makes you say that?" "Because you fed me bread and preserves and made fresh coffee," he said, "and you have been asking me questions for the past hour that are not about the land deal, and I have been answering them, and we are both still here." The silence that followed was the comfortable kind, which was unusual between two people who had known each other for less than 3 hours. Augusta folded her hands on the table and looked at them, and then looked at him. "The barn," she said, because she needed to think about practical things. "I need the eastern corner repaired before winter. The cost of that is, with materials and labor, somewhere around $40. The railroad deal would have given me the money for that and more. Without it, I need to find another way. What are your options?" I can sell 2 head of cattle, which I don't want to do because I can't afford the size reduction. I can apply for a bank loan, which I have done before and which involves sitting across from Gerald Whitmore at the Birch Hollow Bank and being condescended to for 45 minutes before he signs anything. She paused. Or I can patch the corner myself with what I have in the barn and hope it holds the winter, which it probably will not. Peter was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the table with the expression of a man thinking something through carefully before he said it. I know a bit about barn construction, he said. I grew up on a farm, as I mentioned. My father's barn went down in a storm in '71 and we rebuilt it ourselves. I could look at the corner tomorrow morning if you're willing, and tell you honestly whether you can patch it or whether it needs full replacement. There might be a less expensive solution than you're imagining. Augusta looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, measuring him, which was a thing she did and which most men found uncomfortable. Peter Calloway looked back at her without flinching and without performing. You would do that, she said. If you'll let me, he said. I'm not due back in Hatchfield until Friday. I have 2 days. You'd stay in Birch Hollow, Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. Yes, it's a short ride. Augusta drummed her fingers once on the table. I appreciate the offer, she said. I will think about it. That's fair, he said. She got up and went to the stove and checked the fire, not because it needed checking, but because she needed a moment to herself in the corner of her own kitchen. She put 2 more sticks of wood in out of habit and stared at the small orange glow through the iron grate. She was 28 years old and she had been alone for 3 years, and she was not a woman who made decisions without thinking them through, and she was not a woman who trusted people quickly or easily. These were true things. Also true, there was a man at her table who had ridden 30 miles to give her bad news and had done it honestly and with his hat in his hands, and who had listened to her for 2 hours with the kind of genuine attention that was not the same as patience and was rarer than most people understood. She turned back. Mr. Calloway, would you like more coffee? Something in his expression softened. Yes, Mrs. Rhodes, I would. She poured it and sat back down, and they talked through the full dark, which came fast in August in Nebraska, the stars appearing in great unobstructed numbers above the plains as they always did, brilliant and indifferent and beautiful. They talked about Missouri and about Nebraska, and about the difference between the two, which was the difference between a country that had been tamed and a country that was still in the process of deciding whether to be tamed. They talked about the Indian Territory to the south, and Peter told her about a Pawnee family he had surveyed land with the previous year. A father and his 2 adult sons, who knew every inch of the Republican River Valley, with a precision and depth that made his own survey maps look like hasty sketches. And he said it with genuine respect, without the dismissiveness that Augusta had heard from many men when they spoke of the people who had been in this land long before any survey office or railroad company had appeared, and she was glad to hear it. She told him about the summer of 1880, when a dry lightning storm had taken the eastern fence, and 3 of her cattle had wandered 20 miles before a Lakota family had found them and brought them back, and how the 2 men who had ridden in with her cattle had refused payment, but had accepted coffee, and had spoken with her for an hour about the drought conditions, and had known things about the grasses and the water table that no one at the county agricultural extension had told her. Things that had genuinely helped her through the second dry summer. Peter listened. He did not interrupt, he did not redirect. He simply listened with his whole attention, and Augusta, who had been talking to cattle and the wind and the occasional neighbor for 3 years, felt something in her that had been clenched very tight for a very long time beginning to loosen. Around 8 o'clock she made supper, because she was hungry and he was still there, and it seemed absurd not to. It was a simple meal, salt pork and fried potatoes and more bread, the food of a woman who cooked for efficiency rather than pleasure, but he ate it with the same sincere appreciation he had brought to the bread and preserves. He helped her clear the table afterward without being asked, which was a small thing and was not a small thing. "Tell me about your family," she said, when they had settled back with fresh coffee and the dishes were done. The lamp on the table was the main light now, the orange kerosene glow making the kitchen close and warm and separate from the vast dark outside. "My mother died when I was 16, he said. "Fever. My father remarried 2 years later, a woman who was perfectly kind and who I never quite knew what to do with. My brothers are all still in Missouri, the three of them within 15 miles of each other, which I think is both their greatest comfort and their great limitation. They are good men. We write." He paused. "I never married. I was engaged once to a woman in St. Joseph named Catherine, but she married someone else about 3 months before I came west, and it was the right decision for both of us, though I didn't see it that way at the time." "What happened?" "She wanted the life that was already in St. Joseph," he said. "Parlors and calling cards and a husband who came home at the same time every evening. I wanted something I couldn't name yet, which made me a poor prospect." He turned his coffee cup. "I can name it now, I think. I wanted to feel necessary to something that was real, not to a social arrangement, to something that actually mattered." Augusta was very still. "Do you feel that in the survey work?" "Sometimes," he said. "When I tell someone the truth about their land and they can use it to make a real decision. When I stop something unfair from happening, which doesn't happen as often as I'd like." He looked at her. "I felt it today, if I'm being honest. Telling you the truth about that clause, about the deal being below market value. You deserve to know those things accurately." She held his gaze. The lamp flickered slightly in a draft from somewhere, a brief trembling of light that made the shadows move. "You are a strange sort of man to work for a land office," she said. "I have been told that," he said. "I mean it as a compliment." "I know," he said. "I could tell." Outside, a coyote called from somewhere across the dark prairie, that eerie, beautiful, lonesome sound that was the voice of the open country at night, and Augusta heard it with the familiarity of 3 years of nights alone in this house, but tonight it sounded different, less lonesome than usual, which she noticed and did not comment on. "I'm going to accept your offer," she said. "About the barn." "All right," he said. "Not because I can't figure it out myself," she said. "I know. Because it makes practical sense to have a second opinion from someone who actually knows barn construction." "That's exactly what it is," he said, with a gravity that was slightly too perfect to be entirely earnest, and she smiled at that, a real smile that she gave him directly across the table, and he gave her one back. He left at 9:30, which was later than either of them had planned, the ride to Birch Hollow made by moonlight across the open grassland. She stood on the porch and watched his lamp lantern disappear over the ridge, the small moving point of light growing smaller and smaller until it was gone, and she stood there for a moment after it was gone in the warm August dark with her arms folded, and her heart doing something complicated that she was not ready to give a name to. She went inside and looked at the stack of documents on the kitchen table, and at the 2 coffee cups that were still there, and at the chair where Peter Calloway had sat for 6 hours, and she thought about the barn and the cattle and the $40 and the railroad, and then she thought about none of those things at all. She went to bed, and she did not sleep for a long time. Peter Calloway arrived the next morning at 7, which was the respectable hour for arriving at a woman's property when you were not kin and not hired, early enough to be serious about the work, but not so early as to be presumptuous. Augusta had been up since 5, which was her usual time, had already fed the cattle and checked the water and walked the north fence line, and was on her second cup of coffee when she heard his horse. He came around the corner of the barn with his hat on and his coat off, sleeves rolled to the elbow in the morning air, and looked up at her on the porch and said good morning in that steady, quiet voice, and she told him good morning back and handed him a cup of coffee through the porch rail, which he accepted with both hands. They walked around to the eastern corner of the barn together. Augusta showed him the problem, the section where the boards had warped and separated, where the roof overhang was sagging, and where, when the wind came from the northeast as it did regularly in October and November, rain and eventually snow would get in above the horse stalls. She told him what the carpenter in Birch Hollow had quoted her, which had been the reason she had been hoping for the railroad deal in the first place. Peter walked the full corner slowly, pressing boards with his thumb, looking at the junction where the wall met the roof line, crouching down to look at the foundation, standing back and looking at the overall slope. He did not speak for a long time, and Augusta stood back and let him look, and she watched him with his sleeves rolled up and his coffee cup in one hand and his serious, careful attention on the corner of her barn, and she felt something she was going to have to start acknowledging soon. "The carpenter quoted you for replacement," Peter said when he had finished his circuit. "But you don't need replacement. These boards are sound except for the top course here, which has taken the weather damage. You need to pull the top course, replace those boards, reflash the roof junction with new tin, and add 2 diagonal braces here and here." He pointed. "Materials would cost you $12, maybe $14. A day's work, maybe a day and a half." The carpenter was either being dishonest or he was being lazy about the diagnosis. Augusta looked at where he was pointing. She looked at the barn with fresh eyes, measuring what he was saying against what she could see. "You're sure," she said. "I'm sure about the diagnosis," he said. "I'd stake my professional accuracy on it, which is the thing I'm most careful with." She was quiet for a moment. $12. $12 she could find, even now, even without the railroad deal. $12 was manageable. $12 did not require selling cattle or sitting across from Gerald Whitmore. "Where would I get the materials?" she said. "Birch Hollow has a lumber yard," he said. "I passed it yesterday. They'll have what you need." He paused and she could see him deciding something. "I can help you do the work if you'll allow it. I told you I have 2 days. She looked at him. The morning light was the flat, clear, honest light of early day, none of the flattering amber of the previous evening. And in this light he was simply a man standing by her barn with his sleeves rolled up and coffee in his hand. And what she saw in this honest light was exactly what she had seen in the warm light of last night. A man who was steady and truthful and kind, who looked at things with precise attention, who listened. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I want to ask you something and I want you to answer it honestly." "All right," he said. "Why are you still here?" The question landed in the cool morning air between them, and neither of them pretended not to understand what she was actually asking, because they had been having the same conversation under many different surface conversations for 16 hours now, and they were both, apparently, too honest for pretense. Peter Calloway looked at her for a moment, and she watched him choose honesty over convenience, which was, she thought, the most attractive thing she had seen anyone do in a very long time. "Because I don't want to leave," he said. "Because I came out here yesterday with a bad piece of news and a clear errand, and somewhere in the first hour I stopped wanting to finish the errand and go and started wanting to stay and talk, and I've been having a quiet argument with myself about that ever since, and I'm losing it." He paused. "And I think you know exactly why I'm still here, Augusta." It was the first time he had used her given name. It came out with a quiet, careful weight, like a man setting down something precious. She stood in the morning sun beside her barn and looked at this man from Missouri, who had ridden 30 miles to bring her bad news and then had stayed because neither of them could seem to end the conversation, and she felt the thing she had been refusing to name announce itself with the patient certainty of something that had been waiting for permission. "There's coffee inside," she said, "and then we should go to the lumber yard." His expression in the honest morning light was something she was going to keep for a long time. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They went to Birch Hollow together in her wagon, the bay horse tied on behind. The road was dry and dusty, the August prairie on either side of them humming with insects and wind, and they sat on the wagon bench with an appropriate 6 inches between them and talked about lumber and roof flashing and the cost of tin, and also about St. Joseph and the Republican River Valley and the taste of coffee made on a wood stove, which Peter maintained was categorically superior to coffee made any other way. In Birch Hollow, they caused a certain amount of quiet comment. It was a small town, about 450 people. The kind of town where Augusta Rhodes arriving with an unfamiliar man was the sort of thing that would be noted and discussed by sundown. Augusta knew this and decided, for once in 3 years, not to care about it. At the lumber yard, Peter spoke with the owner with the confident familiarity of a man who knew the language of materials and measurements, and the owner, who was a reasonable man named Cartwright, gave them a fair price that was even slightly below Peter's estimate. Augusta paid it from the envelope she kept in her coat pocket, and Cartwright and his assistant loaded the boards and tin into her wagon with the businesslike efficiency of men who had other things to do. On the way back to the farm, they stopped at Mrs. Ellis's general store, which was also the place where Birch Hollow's informal social intelligence was gathered and distributed, and Mrs. Ellis herself was behind the counter and looked at Peter Calloway with the sharp, measuring look of a woman who had been keeping track of Augusta Rhodes for 3 years and had opinions about what she saw. "Mrs. Rhodes," she said, "I haven't seen you in 2 weeks." "I've been busy," Augusta said. "Mrs. Ellis, this is Peter Calloway from the Garfield Land and Survey Office in Hatchfield. He's been helping me with some documentation." She paused, giving Mrs. Ellis absolutely nothing more than that, which she knew would drive the woman to distraction. Peter took his hat off and said "How do you do" with a pleasantness that was entirely genuine and unperformed, and Mrs. Ellis looked at him for a moment with those sharp eyes and then looked at Augusta and seemed to revise something in her assessment. "Well," Mrs. Ellis said, "you'll stay for the church social on Saturday, I expect, Mr. Calloway. Mrs. Rhodes hasn't been to one in 6 months." "That's entirely up to Mrs. Rhodes," Peter said. Augusta bought the nails she needed and a pound of coffee and did not commit to anything regarding the church social, and they went back out into the sun and the wagon bench and the dry road home. "You don't have to attend the social," Augusta said when they were out of town. "I know," he said, "she will talk about you regardless." "I know that too. It doesn't bother you," he considered this. "Does it bother you?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said, which surprised her. "I thought it would. I've been careful for 3 years not to give people anything to talk about." "Why?" She watched the road ahead. The prairie rolled and shimmered in the heat, the sky above it enormous and blue and absolute. "Because talk can become a kind of pressure," she said. "People decide what you should do, and then they discuss it until it feels like a truth, and I've needed to make my own decisions without that kind of weight on them." "But today it doesn't bother you," he said. "Today," she said, "I think I might be making a decision that has nothing to do with what anyone in Birch Hollow thinks about it." There was a pause on the wagon bench that was full and warm. "Augusta," he said, and again her name in his voice was precise and careful, and she felt it in the center of her chest. "Peter," she said, "I would like to attend the church social with you on Saturday," he said. "If that is something you would consider." She looked at him. He was watching the road with the faint smile of a man who has said a thing out loud and is now waiting to see what the world does with it. "Saturday is 3 days from now," she said. "You said you had to be back in Hatchfield by Friday." "I can ask for an extension," he said. "Garfield is a reasonable man." He paused. "Fairly reasonable. You would extend your trip for a church social." He turned to look at her fully. "I would extend my trip," he said, "to spend more time with you. The social is simply a reasonable, respectable structure within which to do that." Augusta Rhodes looked at Peter Calloway on the wagon bench in the August sun above the Nebraska plains and felt something that she had been being very careful not to feel for 3 years, and stopped being careful. "Write to Mr. Garfield," she said, "and then help me fix my barn." The next 2 days were the happiest Augusta had been since before Thomas died, which she recognized with a clarity that was equal parts joy and guilt, and then, carefully and consciously, decided to let the guilt be less than the joy, because Thomas had been a good man and he had wanted her to be happy, and she knew it. They worked the barn together, Peter on the ladder with the boards and Augusta handing materials, and directing from below with the particular authority of a woman who knew her own property. He was a good worker, not showy or rushed, steady and accurate and good with his hands in the way of men who had grown up doing the kind of physical work where accuracy actually mattered. She had thought when he first offered that she would have to manage him, direct everything, check his work. She did not have to. He asked questions when he needed to and made decisions when he could and called down to her when he wanted her opinion, and they worked together with an ease that felt, improbably, like they had been working together for years. By midday of the first day, the damaged boards were out and the new boards were in, and the air smelled of fresh-cut lumber, warm and clean and promising. Augusta made lunch and brought it out to the barn in a pail, cornbread and cold meat and 2 jars of water, and they sat on the hay bales just inside the barn door in the shade and ate and talked about nothing in particular, which was the best kind of conversation. "Do you ever think about staying in one place?" she asked. She had been thinking it, but she asked it as though it were a casual question, though they were both too precise in their attention to each other for casual. Peter looked at his cornbread. "I think about it more than I used to," he said. "The survey work means I'm moving most of the time, town to town, negotiation to negotiation. I like the work, but I've been noticing more in the past year or so that there's something missing in it, some weight it doesn't have." "The weight of a place," she said. "The weight of belonging somewhere," he said. "Of knowing a piece of ground well enough that it knows you back." He looked at her. "You have that with this land. I noticed it the moment you talked about the morning walk to the barn." She was quiet for a moment, looking out the open barn door at the yard and the house and the prairie beyond. "It took me a long time," she said. "The first year I was here alone I thought I couldn't do it. Thomas's death, the size of the work, the loneliness. I almost sold and went back to my mother in Illinois." She paused. "I didn't, obviously." "What stopped you?" "One morning in November," she said. "First hard frost, everything silver and still. I walked out to feed the cattle and the light was coming up just pink and gold above the eastern line, and this land looked like it had been made by somebody who cared very much about it, and I thought that I had been here through the hard part and maybe I should stay for the beautiful part." She shook her head slightly. "It's a more dramatic story when I tell it inside my head." "No," he said. "It's exactly that dramatic." He was looking at her with that expression again. The one she was beginning to understand was the face he wore when something had gotten to him, when his precise attention had found something it did not want to look away from. On the second day they reflashed the roof junction and added the diagonal braces, and when they were finished Peter climbed down the ladder and they both stood back and looked at the repaired corner, which looked solid and true and was, Augusta could see, exactly what the barn had needed. "That will hold 20 winters," Peter said. Augusta looked at it for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it simply and fully without qualification or deflection, which was not the way she usually accepted help, but today it was. He turned to look at her and they were standing in the yard in the afternoon sun 3 feet apart, and the moment had a particular quality of weight that she had been feeling building for 2 days. "Augusta," he said. "Peter," she said. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I want to say it clearly because I'm not a man who does well with things left implicit." "I know," she said. "Go ahead." He looked at her with his steady, dark eyes. "I came here 2 days ago to do a job, and I've been thinking for the past 2 days about how it is possible that a person can walk into someone else's life with a piece of bad news and find something there that he didn't know he was missing." He paused. "I'm not going to pretend that I know what this is, or what it could be, because we have known each other for 2 days and I respect you too much to make promises on the basis of 2 days. But I am going to tell you that I would like very much to keep talking to you, that I would like to write to you, if you'll allow it, and come back when I'm able, and see where a conversation started because neither of us could end it might actually go." Augusta stood in her yard in the August afternoon and looked at this precise, honest man with his hat in his hands and his boots dusty from her barn work, and something in her chest that had been cold for 3 years was not cold anymore. "I would like that," she said, "very much." He smiled at her then, a full smile, unguarded and warm, and she gave him one back that was the same, and they stood in the sun by the repaired barn like two people who had just agreed on something important which they had. They went to the church social on Saturday. Augusta wore her blue dress, which was the nicest thing she owned that was still practical, and she braided her hair and pinned it up and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and decided she looked like herself, which was what she was going for. She drove herself in the wagon and met Peter outside the church, and when she came around the corner and saw him standing there with his hat in his hands and his Sunday coat on, and his expression one of someone who had been waiting and was glad to see who he had been waiting for, she felt something so simply, uncomplicated good that she laughed a little as she climbed down from the wagon, and he came to offer his hand and looked at her with quiet delight. The social was the usual kind: tables of food, fiddle music, children running in the churchyard, the adult conversation circling the usual subjects of weather and cattle prices, and who had married or died or moved. Augusta introduced Peter to the people she knew, which was most of the town, and watched them assess him and watched him be himself, easy and genuine and not trying to make an impression, and she saw people's assessments settle into something favorable. Mrs. Ellis found them near the pie table and looked between them with barely concealed satisfaction. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I'm glad you stayed." "So am I," he said. Mrs. Ellis looked at Augusta with the expression of a woman who had been right about something for a long time. Augusta gave her a look that said very clearly, "Do not make a production of this," and Mrs. Ellis, to her credit, simply smiled and moved on. When the fiddle player started up with a reel, it was Peter who turned to Augusta with a questioning look, and Augusta who said yes before he finished asking. They danced 2 reels and a waltz, and she had forgotten in 3 years that she loved dancing, that she was actually quite good at it. And Peter was good too, solid and sure-footed on the turns, leading without insisting on it, which was about as good a metaphor as you could find for the whole of his character. On the drive home, she sat in her wagon under the stars and felt the solid, warm weight of the evening behind her, and thought about writing and visits and all the ordinary practical steps by which two people moved toward each other across the particular terrain of adult life. He rode alongside her wagon to her gate and they said good night there, and he looked at her from the saddle in the starlight and she looked up at him. And there was a moment that had the quality of all the previous moments between them distilled, the quality of something about to be, and he reached down and took her hand where it rested on the wagon rail and held it carefully for a moment. And she let him, and they looked at each other in the dark with everything still in front of them. "I'll write when I'm back in Hatchfield," he said. "I'll write back," she said. He rode away and she sat in the wagon for a moment, listening to his horse's hoofbeats fade, and then she drove herself home to her house and her land, and she went inside and looked at the kitchen table where they had talked for 6 hours 2 days ago, and felt the particular profound happiness of a person who, after a long cold season, has found something worth growing. The letters began the following week, and they were the kind of letters that told Augusta everything she needed to know about the character of the man writing them. Peter Calloway wrote the way he spoke, directly and with precision, and with more warmth than his manner initially suggested. His letters were long and covered everything: the work at the land office, a particularly complicated survey of a disputed homestead claim that he had spent 3 days untangling, his thoughts on a book he had been reading, a description of a storm that had come through Hatchfield with 2 inches of rain, and what the land looked like afterward, gray-green and smelling of new water. Augusta wrote back with equal length and equal honesty. She told him about the cattle and the fence and the first cool nights of September coming down off the north, and the way the cottonwood along the creek turned yellow in a single week as though they had all agreed on it. She told him about a conversation she had had with her nearest neighbor, old Frank Hewitt, who was 73 and had been on his claim since before Nebraska was a state, and who had told her once that the land out here would teach you things if you were patient, and that he reckoned she was the most patient young woman he had met in 40 years, which was as close to a compliment as Frank Hewitt got, and which she valued accordingly. Peter came back in October. He rode in on a Thursday afternoon, and she heard the horse from the pasture where she was repairing a section of fence, and she straightened up and felt the plain, uncomplicated happiness of it move through her like warmth. They shook hands when he dismounted, which made them both smile because they both understood it was not quite right anymore, but neither of them had established new terms yet. He had brought a book he had mentioned in one of his letters, A Natural History of the Great Plains, and he gave it to her from his saddlebag with the directness of a person who does not try to make small gifts into large gestures. She thanked him and held it, and they stood in the afternoon with the October air clean and sharp around them. "How long?" she asked. "3 days," he said. "I have a survey to do north of Birch Hollow on the creek properties." "Then come to dinner tonight," she said. "And tomorrow if you're free." "Tonight and tomorrow," he agreed. He came to dinner that evening, and they sat at the kitchen table again, which had come to feel, in Augusta's mind, like the place where they existed together most naturally, and they talked for 4 hours, and it was as easy as the letters and easier than the first night because they were no longer strangers. There was a familiarity building between them now, a map of each other that was more detailed with every conversation, every letter, every hour spent in the same place. He told her that he had spoken to Garfield about his future with the office, and that Garfield had, in fact, been talking about opening a branch in Birch Hollow County, which was growing fast enough with new homestead claims and cattle operations to justify a permanent surveying and documentation presence. There was nothing decided yet, Peter said carefully, but it was a possibility he was considering. Augusta listened to this with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and said nothing more than that it sounded like a practical consideration. But she was watching him over the rim, and he was watching her, and they both understood what was being said under what was being said. On the second day, he helped her move the cattle to the winter pasture, and they worked alongside each other in the cold morning air with the efficiency of two people who had found their working rhythm and were comfortable in it. He was good with the cattle, better than she had expected from a man who primarily worked with papers and measurements, and she told him so, and he said he had spent enough of his life on farms to know which side of the gate to be on when driving cattle, and they both laughed in the cold October air, and their breath came out in small white clouds that mingled and dispersed. That afternoon she made a proper supper, a roasted chicken from the yard and potatoes and carrots from the garden, and she set the table with the good cloth that she had not used since the last Christmas Thomas was alive, and she did not do this without acknowledging to herself exactly what she was doing and what it meant. When Peter came in from washing at the pump and saw the table, he was quiet for a moment, and she saw that he understood also. They sat and ate, and the conversation moved through everything and nothing and landed finally in the place it had been moving toward all evening, the place it had been moving toward since August. "Augusta," he said. "I know," she said. "I haven't said it yet. I know what you're going to say." He looked at her with that expression, the one she had learned was his face for things that mattered. "I would like to say it," he said, "because I'm a precise man and I want to be precise about this." She set down her fork. The lamp between them made everything warm and close. "Then say it," she said. "I am in love with you," he said, simply, directly, with the same quality of honesty he brought to everything. "I have been, I think, since some time in the second hour on the first night when you told me about the cottonwood trees and the way the morning light looked over this land. And I want you to know it clearly and without ambiguity so that you can make a clear decision about what you want to do with that information." Augusta Rhodes looked at the man across her table, the one who had come with bad news and a leather satchel, and the kind of honesty that was rarer than most things, who had stayed 6 hours because neither of them could end the conversation, who had written her letters that told her about storms and surveys and books, who had fixed her barn and danced with her at the church social and ridden 30 miles twice, and would probably ride 30 miles many more times. And she felt the wholeness of what she felt for him as clearly as she had ever felt anything. "I am in love with you too, Peter," she said, "since somewhat earlier than the second hour, if I'm being equally precise. I think it was when you apologized for suggesting there was a silver lining." He stared at her for a moment. Then he laughed, that full, unguarded laugh that changed his whole face, and she laughed with him, and the kitchen was warm with it, with both of them together in the lamp light on a cold October evening in Nebraska, laughing. He took her hand across the table. She gave it to him. They sat like that for a while, talking and not talking, in the good warmth of two people who have said the true thing and found it met. He asked her to marry him in January, which he did in person, having ridden from Hatchfield in cold so sharp it made the air ring, arriving at her door with snow on his hat and a look of absolute determination on his face. He had, he told her, already been accepted for the Birch Hollow County branch of the Garfield office, which would be opening in the spring. He had, he told her, already spoken to Mr. Garfield about making it a permanent position. He had not, he told her very clearly, done these things to make the proposal more appealing. He had done them because they made sense for his own life regardless. But he wanted her to know the full picture so she could decide with all the information available. Augusta let him finish, and then she said yes, which she had known she would say since approximately October, but which was still one of the most significant words she had ever spoken, and which she gave him without ceremony but with her whole self behind it. He kissed her then, in the doorway of her house with snow still melting off his hat, and it was warm and right, and felt like something she had been moving toward for a long time without knowing it. They were married in April of 1883, in the small white church in Birch Hollow, where they had danced their first waltz. Mrs. Ellis wept openly, and without apology. Old Frank Hewitt attended and shook Peter's hand with the gravity of a man conferring a significant honor. Peter's brother James rode out from Missouri for the occasion, and spent a week at the farm helping to expand the house with the new room that would be needed. He said with a grin, sooner than they thought. The ceremony was simple and honest, like both of them. Augusta wore the blue dress again, the same one she had worn to the social, because it was who she was and she did not want to be anyone different on this day than she was on every other day. Peter stood at the altar without fuss or performance and looked at her when she came down the aisle with the expression she had come to understand was the face he wore for things that mattered, and she walked toward it without looking anywhere else. The minister read the vows and they repeated them, and the words felt to Augusta not like a promise being made but like a truth being named, a thing that already existed and was now simply being acknowledged in front of witnesses. They rode home together in the wagon, the April plains green and wind moved around them, the sky enormous and blue and full of the particular New World feeling of spring in Nebraska. Augusta put her head against Peter's shoulder on the wagon bench, the first time she had done something so simple and instinctive in a very long time, and he put his arm around her, and they drove home to the house that was now their house on the land that was now their land. The summer was good. Peter's office work in Birch Hollow was slower to build than in Hatchfield, which meant he was home more than either of them had expected, and the extra time was used on the farm, the things Augusta had been managing alone for 3 years, the fence work and the cattle and the slow project of improving the land year by year. Peter threw himself into it with the same precise, genuine attention he brought to everything, and Augusta found, to her pleasure and mild surprise, that she loved working alongside him, loved the way their different competencies fit together, hers the deep knowledge of this particular land, and his the broader technical knowledge that saw problems differently. By late summer the cattle herd was 22 head, which was what Augusta had always said she needed, and the barn stood solid with its repaired corner, and the house had a new room and a proper wooden floor in the kitchen where there had been packed earth before, and the life they were building felt both ambitious and deeply rooted. In November, Augusta confirmed what she had suspected since September and told Peter on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen over dinner, simply and directly, because simple and direct was who they were. His face did a thing she had never seen it do before, something that was past all his usual precise composure, something open and stunned and profoundly moved, and he set down his fork and came around the table to her and held her face in his hands with extraordinary gentleness and said her name, just that, just Augusta, and she felt the weight of everything they had built together in the single syllable of it. Their son was born in June of 1884, on a morning that was clear and warm with the particular generosity of early summer, when the grass was as green as it was going to get, and the cottonwood along the creek were full and rustling in the south wind. He was born in the house he was going to grow up in, and he was healthy and loud about it, and Peter held him with the shaking, careful hands of a man who has never held a newborn before and is suddenly, completely, undone by the experience. They named him Thomas James Calloway. Thomas for Augusta's first husband, because he had been a good man, and this land had been his land first, and some things were worth honoring. James for Peter's brother, who had helped build the room the baby would sleep in. It was a name with history in it, and Augusta felt that was right, that the new life should carry something of the old one with it rather than pretend it had not existed. Frank Hewitt came over to see the baby and held him with the practiced ease of a man who had raised 4 children and had 11 grandchildren, and told Augusta that Thomas James had the look of a person who would have opinions about things, which coming from Frank Hewitt was the finest possible forecast for a child's character. The years moved with the particular rhythm of the plains, which was the rhythm of weather and season and the slow, steady accumulation of a life. Peter's land office work in Birch Hollow grew as the county grew, and by 1886 he had 2 assistants and enough work to keep all 3 of them fully occupied. Augusta expanded the cattle operation to 30 head and added 20 acres of hay production on the north end of the property, which gave them the fodder security she had always wanted against a bad winter. Their second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1886, and they named her Margaret Rose, for Peter's mother whose name had been Margaret, and for no particular reason on the Rose except that Augusta had always loved the word. She was a different child than Thomas James in every way, quieter and more watchful, and possessed from infancy of a careful observational quality that Peter recognized immediately as familiar. "She looks at things the way you look at maps," Augusta told him, watching the baby study her own hands with intense focus. "Then she'll be precise about the things that matter," he said, and said it with such uncomplicated pride that Augusta loved him even more in that moment, which was something she had come to expect but never entirely got used to. The way her love for him found new depths at unexpected moments. Thomas James was 3 when his sister was born, and approached the situation with the pragmatic adaptability of a child who has been raised on a working ranch and understands that new things arrive and you figure out what to do with them. He was interested in the baby for approximately 4 days, and then went back to following Peter around the yard with the single-minded dedication of a small person who has decided exactly who he wants to be when he grows up. Augusta watched her husband and her son in the yard one evening, Peter explaining something about the fence posts, while Thomas James listened with his whole small body tilted forward in concentration, and she felt the fullness of her life settle around her like a warm coat on a cold evening, like a thing she had not known she was missing until she had it and now could not imagine having been without it. In 1887, the Northern Pacific, in an irony Augusta appreciated fully, ran a branch line through the county 20 miles north, not the route they had originally proposed and not near her land, and the increase in regional commerce it brought raised land values and cattle prices across the area in a way that benefited everyone. Augusta received a letter from Mr. Garfield's land office, written by a different surveyor, inquiring whether she might be interested in selling a strip of the northern edge of her property for a wagon road easement connected to the new rail access. Peter brought the letter home and put it on the kitchen table and looked at her with barely concealed amusement. "Well," Augusta said, reading it. "Well," Peter said, "the compensation is reasonable," she said. "Above market for an easement," he agreed. "The northern strip is not sentimental ground," she said. "It's hay production we can manage differently." "It is," he agreed. She put the letter down. "You were that surveyor," she said, 3 years ago when you walked into this kitchen with a different piece of news from the same railroad." "I was," he said, "and now here is another letter on the same table." "Life," Peter said, "has a particular sense of humor." Augusta looked at her husband and the lamplight between them and the house around them that was full of 2 children asleep in their beds and the accumulated warmth of 4 years of building something together. And she felt something that she had no precise word for, something that encompassed gratitude and wonder and love, and the particular deep satisfaction of a person who has been tested by life and has not been broken by it. "I'm going to accept the easement offer," she said. "I think it's the right decision," he said, "and I'm going to write to Mr. Garfield myself and remind him that the compensation in the last negotiation was below market." "I know you are," Peter said, smiling. "I was right about that the first time." "You were right about that the first time," he agreed. She wrote the letter the next morning and negotiated the easement at a rate 15% above the initial offer, which was fair market compensation, and which she accepted when it was met without further negotiation, because she was a precise woman and she knew when a number was right. The money went toward a new milk cow and a proper kitchen range to replace the old iron stove that had been in the house since Thomas's parents had built it. And the new range was a thing of such practical beauty, even and reliable and large enough to cook properly for a family, that Augusta stood looking at it the morning after it was installed with a feeling that was entirely disproportionate to the subject of a cooking range, but that was entirely about what the cooking range meant, which was stability and security and the particular luxury of a life that had things in it that you had chosen rather than simply survived. Peter came in from the yard and found her looking at the range and came to stand beside her, and they stood together in the kitchen looking at this fine practical object in the morning light. "I have a theory," Peter said, "that for you this range is not really about cooking." "Tell me your theory," she said. "I think it is about the same thing that the repaired barn corner was about," he said, "and the 22 head of cattle and the hay acreage. It is about a life that has been made rather than merely survived." Augusta looked at her husband in the morning light of the kitchen where they had first talked for 6 hours 3 years ago. This precise and honest man who had ridden 30 miles with bad news and stayed because neither of them could end the conversation. And she found she had no words that were adequate to what she was feeling, and so she took his hand instead, which said it more accurately anyway. He held her hand, and they stood together in the kitchen with the good range between them, and the sound of the children beginning to stir somewhere in the house. Thomas James's particular morning enthusiasm already audible through the walls, and outside the window the Nebraska morning coming up in its irreducible way, the light lifting off the grassland and the creek cottonwood catching the first gold of it, the cattle visible in the near pasture, the barn with its solid, repaired corner standing against the sunrise, the land rolling out in every direction under the enormous sky, patient and particular and theirs. The third child came in the winter of 1889, another boy, and they named him Frank, for Frank Hewitt, who had died that autumn at 79 on his claim, which was the right way for Frank Hewitt to have gone. And naming the baby Frank was a way of honoring a man who had told Augusta on one November morning in 1880 that the land would teach her things if she was patient, which it had. Frank Calloway was from the beginning a cheerful and uncomplicated child, which his older siblings regarded as either admirable or suspicious depending on the day and their own moods, and which his parents found simply wonderful, because, The world needed people who were cheerfully uncomplicated, and there were not nearly enough of them. By 1890, the Calloway farm was one of the solid operations of Birch Hollow County. Not the largest and not the most prosperous, but steady and sound and well managed, with a reputation for fair dealing, and for the particular kind of honest stubbornness that the plains both demanded and rewarded. Peter's land office was the most trusted in the county, which he maintained by doing the thing he had been doing since the beginning, which was reading everything carefully and telling people the truth about what it said. Augusta was 37 in 1890, and she had arrived at the particular quality of life that is the reward of a person who survives the difficult early years and builds something real in the space that opens up afterward. She was strong and specific and in possession of herself in a way that felt like something earned rather than simply arrived at, and she moved through the life she had made with the ease of a woman who knows where she is and knows why she is there. Thomas James at 6 was already following Peter on survey jobs when school was not in session, learning the measurements and the instruments with the seriousness of a child who is genuinely interested rather than just seeking approval, and Peter taught him with the patience of a man who loves both the subject and the student. Margaret at 4 was the kind of child who sat very still and noticed things, and then said something precise about them at an unexpected moment. And Augusta recognized in this quality the same one that had drawn her to Peter in the first place, the quality of paying real attention. One evening in September of 1890, Augusta and Peter sat on the porch after the children were in bed, in the cooled air of the early autumn evening, watching the stars come up over the eastern grass, the same stars that had been up there every night of the 8 years Augusta had been on this land, constant and brilliant and impersonal in the way of things that predate all human arrangement. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Peter asked. "Often," she said. "I came to tell you bad news," he said. "You did, and then I stayed for 6 hours. You did," she said. "I think about that. I think about how different everything would be if one of us had been more decisive about ending the conversation. I was not going to end it," he said, "not once it had become what it became." What was it by then? He considered this with his usual seriousness. "It was the beginning of something I hadn't known I was looking for," he said. "And I think on some level I knew, even then, that if I let it end too soon I would regret it for the rest of my life." Augusta leaned her head against his shoulder, the way she still did on wagon benches and porch chairs, and anywhere else the angle was right, because it still felt as natural and right as it had the first time. "The barn needed fixing," she said. "The barn needed fixing," he agreed. "And the railroad deal had fallen through, which seemed like the worst possible thing at the time. And turned out to be the best possible thing," he said. They sat in the autumn evening and listened to the prairie, which was never entirely silent and was more beautiful for it, the wind in the grass and the distant calling of night birds, and the particular deep quiet of a country that went on in all directions beyond the reach of any lamp, and they sat in it together, these two people who had found each other in the middle of a bad piece of news and had stayed because neither of them could end the conversation and had been here ever since. Inside, the children slept. In the barn, the cattle stood in their stalls in the warm straw. The new range stood solid in the kitchen. The repaired barn corner stood against the night. The land ran out in every direction under the stars, theirs and familiar and known. Augusta Rhodes, who had become Augusta Calloway on an April morning in 1883, held her husband's hand on the porch of the house that was hers, and had been made more itself by the years and the work and the people who lived in it, and felt the complete and particular happiness of a life that had been both harder and better than she had imagined when she was young, and that was entirely, specifically, irreplaceably her own. She thought about what Frank Hewitt had told her in the November of her first winter alone, that the land would teach her things if she was patient. She thought it had taught her many things, about weather and cattle and fences and the precise qualities of different kinds of silence. But the truest thing she thought it had taught her was this: that sometimes the bad news and the good news arrive in the same person on the same horse on the same August afternoon, and the only thing you need to do to tell the difference is to not end the conversation too soon. She squeezed her husband's hand and he squeezed back, and above them the Nebraska stars went on being brilliant and indifferent and beautiful, as they always had, as they always would, indifferent to the particular human happiness happening beneath them, which needed no celestial acknowledgement to be exactly and completely real.